When we think of the Old West, images of rugged cowboys, dusty saloons, and lawless frontiers often come to mind. But what about the women? For too long, their stories have been overshadowed by the mythos of the Wild West as a man's world. The truth is that women were just as integral to shaping the American frontier as their male counterparts. From Native American women who were the original stewards of the land, to Black pioneers, Hispanic ranchers, and sharpshooting cowgirls. The West was built on the resilience, ingenuity, and defiance of women who refused to be confined by tradition. They weren't just wives or sidekicks, but warriors, entrepreneurs, outlaws, and lawmakers. They healed communities, fought for justice, carved paths where none existed. This is the untold story of women in the Old West. When discussing the Old West, we often forget who was there first: Native American women. Long before cowboys and settlers arrived, these women were the backbone of their communities. They weren't just side characters in the story of the West. They were the original pioneers, shaping the land and culture in ways that still resonate today. The Navajo, for example. Navajo women were master weavers, creating intricate blankets and rugs that became highly sought after. These weren't just beautiful art pieces. They were a form of currency and a way to preserve their culture. And let's not forget their role in agriculture. Women in tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi were the primary farmers, growing corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, that sustained their people for centuries. But it wasn't all peaceful coexistence. When European settlers arrived, Native American women faced unimaginable challenges. They were often the ones holding their communities together during forced relocations and violent conflicts. The Sacagawea, for instance. You've probably heard of her as the Shoshone woman who guided Lewis and Clark, but her story goes much deeper. She wasn't just a guide, but a diplomat, translator, and symbol of resilience. Her presence alone signaled to other tribes that the expedition wasn't a war party, which helped keep the peace during their journey. And then there's Lawwomen, the Apache warrior sister of Chief Victorio. Lawwomen wasn't only a fighter, she was a strategist and healer. Known as the Apache Joan of Arc, she played a crucial role in her people's resistance against U.S. forces. Her ability to track enemies and her bravery in battle made her a legend among her people. Native American women were also spiritual leaders. In many tribes, women held significant religious roles, conducting ceremonies and passing down oral histories. They were the keepers of tradition, ensuring that their culture survived even in the face of colonization. While the Old West is often painted with a broad brush of Anglo-American cowboys and settlers, the Southwest tells a different story. Hispanic women were unsung heroines. From Texas to California, these women were the glue that held communities together, blending tradition with resilience in a rapidly changing world. Let's start with the ranchos. In the early 19th century, vast stretches of land in California and New Mexico were owned by Hispanic families. Women played a central role in managing these ranchos. They weren't just homemakers. They were businesswomen, overseeing everything from cattle drives to trade negotiations. Take Doña Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, for example. She was one of the first Mexican-American women to publish novels in English. Still, she was also a savvy landowner who fought tirelessly to protect her family's property during the U.S. takeover of California. Then, there were the curanderas, traditional healers who used herbs and spiritual practices to care for their communities. These women were the doctors of their time, treating everything from physical ailments to emotional wounds. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, and their influence can still be seen in modern holistic medicine. But life wasn't always easy. The Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 brought massive changes to the Southwest. Many Hispanic families lost their land, and women often bore the brunt of these losses. Yet, they adapted. They became entrepreneurs, opening bakeries, laundries, and boarding houses to support their families. In Santa Fe, for instance, women like Doña Tulis ran gambling halls. They became some of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the region. Hispanic women also played a key role in preserving cultural traditions. They kept the music, food, and language alive, even as their communities faced pressure to assimilate. Their resilience and creativity laid the foundation for the vibrant Hispanic culture in the Southwest today. The story of the Old West isn't complete without acknowledging the African American women who journeyed there. These women often faced double adversity as both women and people of color. These women were pioneers in every sense of the word, carving out lives for themselves and their families in a land that wasn't always welcoming. After the Civil War, many African Americans moved west for freedom and opportunity. This migration, known as the Exoduster movement, brought thousands of black families to Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. Women were at the heart of this movement, not just as wives and mothers, but as leaders and entrepreneurs. Take Clara Brown, for example. Born into slavery, she gained her freedom and moved to Colorado during the gold rush. There, she became a successful businesswoman, running a laundry service and using her wealth to help other black settlers. She was known as the Angel of the Rockies for her generosity and community spirit. Then there's Mary Fields, also known as Stagecoach Mary. Standing 6 feet tall and with a reputation for toughness, Mary became the first African American woman to work as a mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. She braved harsh weather, bandits, and rugged terrain to deliver mail in Montana. But Mary wasn't just tough. She was deeply respected in her community. When she wasn't delivering mail, she ran a restaurant and babysat local children. African American women also played a crucial role in building communities. They founded churches, schools, and social organizations that provided support and a sense of belonging. In Nicodemus, Kansas, one of the first black settlements in the West, women were instrumental in establishing schools and teaching children. They understood that education was key to breaking the cycle of poverty and discrimination. But life in the West wasn't without its challenges. Racism and sexism were ever present, and black women often had to work twice as hard to prove themselves. Yet they endured. The California Gold Rush is often portrayed as a man's adventure. Still, women were there too, and their stories are anything but ordinary. While men rushed to the rivers with pans and pickaxes, women carried out their paths to success, often without touching a speck of gold. Let's start with the entrepreneurs. Women like Lucina Stanley Wilson saw an opportunity, whereas others saw chaos. When Lucina arrived in California with her husband, they quickly realized that mining wasn't their ticket to fortune. Instead, she opened a boarding house, feeding and housing miners too busy chasing gold to cook for themselves. At one point, she was making $10,000 a month, equivalent to over $300,000 today. Lucina wasn't alone. Countless women ran businesses like bakeries, laundries, and saloons, proving that the real gold rush wasn't in the rivers and the towns around them. Then there were the entertainers. The gold rush brought a wave of performers to the West, including dancers, singers, and actresses. A famous dancer and actress, Lola Montez, became a sensation in San Francisco. Known for her spider dance, She captivated audiences and even had a brief romance with a wealthy mine owner. But Lola wasn't just a performer. She was a trailblazer, using her fame to advocate for women's independence in a male-dominated world. But life wasn't all glitz and glamour. Many women faced hardship and danger. Prostitution was rampant in mining towns, and while some women chose the profession as a means of survival, others were forced into it. These women often lived in squalid conditions, with little protection or respect. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, some managed to carve out better lives. For example, Eleanor Dumont, also known as Madame Moustache, became a famous gambler and businesswoman, running her salon and earning a reputation as one of the sharpest card players in the West. When we think of outlaws in the Old West, names like Billy the Kid and Jesse James come to mind. But what about the women? That's right. Some of the most notorious figures in Wild West history were women who defied societal norms and lived on their terms. We have the likes of Belle Starr, for example. Known as the Bandit Queen, Belle was a larger-than-life figure who rode with some of the most infamous gangs of her time. She wasn't just a sidekick, but a mastermind, planning robberies and evading the law with cunning and style. Belle's life was shrouded in mystery and myth, but one thing's for sure. She wasn't afraid to break the rules. Her flamboyant personality and penchant for danger made her a legend in her own right. Then there's Laura Bullion, a member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Laura wasn't just a pretty face, but a skilled thief and getaway artist. She participated in train and bank robberies, often disguising herself as a man to avoid detection. Laura's life of crime eventually caught up with her, and she spent time in prison, but even after her release, she lived a quiet life under an assumed name, proving that even outlaws could reinvent themselves. However, not all female outlaws were motivated by greed. Some, like Pearl Hart, turned to crime out of desperation. Pearl became famous for robbing a stagecoach in Arizona, making her one of history's few female robbers. Her story captured the public's imagination, and she became a symbol of rebellion against society's constraints. The Old West wasn't just a playground for outlaws. It was also a battleground for justice, and women were right there in the thick of it. While men often took the spotlight as sheriffs and marshals, women played crucial roles in maintaining law and order, sometimes in ways that defied tradition and expectation. Let's start with the legendary Cattle Kate Watson. While her story is often tangled with myth, Cattle Kate was a real woman who stood up to powerful cattle barons in Wyoming. Accused of rustling cattle, she was lynched in 1889, but her defiance against corrupt landowners made her a symbol of resistance. Whether she was truly an outlaw or a victim of injustice, her story highlights the blurred lines between law and lawlessness in the Wild West. Then there's Pearl Hart, who we've already met as an outlaw, but her story doesn't end there. After her infamous stagecoach robbery, Pearl became a folk hero of sorts, representing women's struggle against societal constraints. While her criminal career was short-lived, her audacity captured the imagination of a nation. It challenged the notion that women were too delicate for the rough-and-tumble world of the West. But not all women on the side of justice were outlaws turned heroes. Some, like Fanny Sperry Steele, took a more straightforward approach. Fanny was a sharpshooter and rodeo star who used her skills to protect her Montana homestead from thieves and troublemakers. She wasn't a law officer, but her courage and marksmanship made her a respected figure in her community.
And let's not forget the women who worked within the system. In the late 19th century, many women began breaking into law enforcement. For example, in 1910, Alice Stebbins Wells became one of the first female police officers in the U.S., serving in Los Angeles. While her career began after the traditional Old West era,
she paved the way for women in law enforcement, proving that justice wasn't just a man's job. When we think of cowboys, we picture rugged men on horseback. But the Old West had its fair share of cowgirls, women who could rope, ride, and ranch with the best of them. These women weren't just supporting characters. They were stars in their own right, shaping the culture of the West, and proving that the frontier was no place for gender stereotypes. Let's start with Annie Oakley, the sharpshooter who became a global sensation. Born in 1860, Annie began shooting at a young age to help support her family. By her teens, she was outshooting men twice her age, and her talent eventually landed her a spot in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Annie wasn't just a performer, but a symbol of female empowerment, proving that women could excel in traditionally male-dominated fields. Then there's Calamity Jane, a larger-than-life figure whose exploits became legend. Jane was a skilled rider and sharpshooter who worked as a scout and mule skinner. While her stories were often embellished, there's no denying her impact on Western folklore. She was a true cowgirl, unafraid to live on her terms and challenge societal norms. But cowgirls weren't just performers and legends, but also hard-working ranchers. Women like Lizzie Johnson, known as the Cattle Queen of Texas, managed their own ranches and cattle drives. Lizzie was a savvy businesswoman who negotiated her contracts and kept her finances separate from her husband's, a rarity at the time. Her success proved that women could thrive in the competitive world of ranching. And let's not forget the rodeo stars. In the early 20th century, women like Tad Lucas and Mabel Strickland dominated the rodeo circuit, competing in events like bronc riding and steer wrestling. These women weren't just participants, but pioneers, breaking barriers and inspiring future generations of cowgirls. The Old West wasn't just a place of action and adventure, and a source of inspiration for artists, writers, and photographers. Women were at the forefront of capturing the spirit of the frontier, using their talents to document and interpret the world around them. There lives Mary Halleck Foote. A writer and illustrator, Mary moved west with her husband in the late 19th century and began chronicling life on the frontier. Her stories and drawings offered a nuanced perspective on the West, highlighting its beauty and challenges. While male writers often overshadowed her work, her contributions to Western literature are undeniable. Then there's Laura Gilpin, a pioneering photographer who captured the landscapes and people of the American Southwest. Laura's work focused on the dignity and resilience of Native American communities, offering a counter-narrative to the stereotypes often perpetuated by her contemporaries. Her photographs remain a powerful testament to the diversity and complexity of the West. Let's not forget Willa Cather, one of the most celebrated authors of the American West. While Cather wasn't a pioneer herself, her novels, like O Pioneers and My Antonia, brought the experiences of frontier women to life. Her vivid descriptions and empathetic portrayals of women's struggles and triumphs have made her a literary icon. However, women in the arts weren't observers alone. They were also activists. Photographer Dorothea Lange, though better known for her Depression-era work, began her career documenting the lives of Native Americans in the Southwest. Her images shed light on the injustices faced by these communities, using art as a tool for social change. The Old West was way ahead of the curve regarding women's suffrage. While the rest of the country debated whether women should have the right to vote, Western states and territories led the charge for equality. This wasn't just a coincidence. It reflected women's unique role in shaping the frontier. Let's start with Wyoming, the trailblazer of women's suffrage. In 1869, Wyoming became the first territory to grant women the right to vote, 50 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. Why? Because frontier life demanded that women step up in ways they hadn't back east. They worked alongside men, ran businesses, and built communities, proving they were just as capable of participating in civic life. Esther Morris, a key figure in Wyoming's suffrage movement, even became the first female justice of the peace in the U.S., setting a powerful precedent. But Wyoming wasn't alone. Utah followed suit in 1870, partly due to the influence of active Mormon women in their communities and churches. Colorado became the first state to grant women suffrage through a popular vote in 1893, and Idaho joined the club in 1896. These victories weren't just symbolic, they were a testament to the grit and determination of Western women who refused to be sidelined. Let's not forget the role of women like Abigail Scott Duniway, a suffragist and writer who fought tirelessly for women's rights in Oregon. Through her newspaper, The New Northwest, she championed equality and encouraged women to demand their rightful place in society. Her efforts paid off when Oregon finally granted women the right to vote in 1912.
The Old West wasn't just a place of cowboys and outlaws. It was also a place of healers and teachers, and women were at the forefront of these vital professions. In a land where doctors and schools were few and far between, women stepped up to care for their communities and educate the next generation. Take Dr. Susan LaFlèche Picot, for example. Born on the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska, Susan became the first Native American woman to earn a medical degree in 1889. She returned to her community to provide much-needed health care, often traveling long distances to treat patients. Susan didn't just heal bodies. She fought for better living conditions and advocated for her people's rights, leaving a legacy far beyond medicine. Then there's Mary Elizabeth Lease, a teacher and activist who became known as the Queen of the Populists. While she's best remembered for her fiery speeches on behalf of farmers and workers, Mary also dedicated herself to education, teaching in Kansas schools, and advocating for better opportunities for women and children. However, not all healers and teachers had formal training. Many women relied on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Curanderas, Hispanic healers, used herbs and spiritual practices to treat illnesses. At the same time, midwives delivered babies in remote areas where doctors were scarce. These women were the backbone of frontier healthcare, providing comfort and care in even the most challenging circumstances. And let's not forget the teachers. Women like Olive Mann Isbell, who opened one of the first schools in California during the Gold Rush, played a crucial role in educating frontier children. Often working in one-room schoolhouses with limited resources, these women instilled a love of learning in their students and helped build the foundation for future generations. So, while the cowboy might be the poster child of the Old West, let's not forget the women who kept the Old West alive and thriving. Thank you for joining us once again. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates. See you in our next video.